Look at you. 72 years old, and you've still got nothing to show for it. You really are a loser, and I feel ashamed to carry your name." My son said that in the middle of a packed, upscale restaurant. Then he shot up from his seat, knocking his chair over, and pointed his finger straight at my face like he was pointing at some stray beggar who'd wandered in. The forks stopped mid-air. The whole room held its breath. 50 strangers turned to look at me with pity in their eyes, the kind of look people save for an old man who should have had the decency to know his place and just die already. 40 years living in that run-down house, dragging yourself across filthy construction sites, and you call that a life? He smirked. "I've spent years trying to hide you from my friends. Garrett is a real man. I wish he were my father." His wife giggled, not bothering to hide it. His mother, the woman I'd shared 30 years of my life with, just lowered her face toward her plate and didn't say a single word in my defense. And the man who'd stolen my wife leaned back in his chair and raised his wine glass toward me like a king savoring his victory. And me? I just sat there, quiet, still, because in that moment I realized something that made every ounce of anger inside me pointless. My son genuinely believed that everything he had, he'd built with his own 2 hands. The luxury car parked outside, the penthouse overlooking the entire city, the tech company he beat his chest bragging about, the investors pouring millions of dollars into his dream. He believed all of it was his own doing. He had no idea that every single brick in that empire had been laid quietly by me, and that with one signature, all of it would crumble to ash within 72 hours. My name is Walter Pennington. I'm 72 years old, and I spent my life as a structural engineer in Portland, Oregon. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, because I'm still not sure there are words big enough for it. And somewhere along the way, I want you to ask yourself what you would have done in my place. I did not raise a monster. I want to say that clearly at the start, because it would be easy to paint my son as a villain from the first scene, and that would miss the whole point. My son, a man named Damon, had simply been raised inside a world that taught him only one thing mattered: how much money you could show. And the people who taught him that lesson weren't me. They were his mother, a woman named Corinne, and the man she'd left me for 5 years earlier, a smooth, expensive man named Garrett Vale. The dinner that started everything happened at a restaurant Garrett had chosen. Of course he had. It was the kind of place where the chandeliers looked like sculptures, and the prices weren't printed on the menu, the kind of place designed to make a quiet man in a good but unflashy suit feel like he didn't belong. I wore a charcoal suit I'd owned for 20 years. It was beautifully made, perfectly kept, the suit of a man who valued quality over noise. In Damon's world, there was no room for anything that didn't shout, and everyone at that table was shouting. Damon leaned back in his velvet chair, one arm draped over the back, swirling a glass of red wine in a gesture I recognized instantly. He'd copied it from Garrett. He was announcing, loud enough for the next table to hear, that his company had just closed a second round of funding, that investors were lining up, that it was probably time to upgrade his car. His wife, a polished young woman named Sienna, laughed her little glassy laugh and told him he deserved it, that he'd worked so hard. And I said nothing, because I knew something none of them did. I knew exactly where every dollar of that second round of funding had come from. I knew the name of the firm that wrote the check, and I knew that firm did not exist the way Damon believed it did. But I didn't say a word. I just brought a piece of steak to my mouth and tasted nothing, because all of my attention was on the performance unfolding in front of me. If you've ever sat quietly at a table while people you love measured you and found you lacking, you already know exactly how that steak tasted. Corinne sat there with a tight little smile, and I could barely recognize her. The practical woman I'd married decades ago was gone, replaced by someone who worried whether her handbag was last season. She looked at Garrett like he'd personally invented success. And then she turned to me and said our son was brilliant. Wasn't he? Except it wasn't a question. It was a comparison. Brilliant, unlike you. I just nodded and let it pass. Then Garrett, having let Damon have his moment, leaned in with that deep, patronizing voice and delivered the line men like him have perfected. He said I was a good man, a fine engineer, but that I lacked the spark. He said I built things for other people, but never an empire for myself. He said in this world, if you're not building, you're being buried. And Damon nodded along like a man hearing a sermon, eagerly agreeing that he'd tried so many times to explain ambition to his dated, old-fashioned father. Dated. That was the word that night. Last time it had been cautious, before that traditional. The word kept changing. The contempt never did. The boasting rolled on like a tide, the penthouse with the city views, the upcoming trip to somewhere expensive, the new watch Sienna had bought him. Each story was a stone thrown at my silence, just to hear the sound it made. And then dessert came, and Garrett signaled the waiter and said the check was on his account, his eyes flicking toward me as he said it. One more little performance of power. And that was the moment the thread finally snapped. Damon stood up. His chair scraped hard against the floor, and a few nearby diners turned to look. And in that opulent room, in front of everyone, he gestured from Garrett to me, and said it. That's the difference. Dad, you're a loser. You've spent your whole life in that dusty old house on dirty job sites. Then he turned to Garrett, his voice full of admiration, and said, Garrett's not. He's a winner. The air went thick. Sienna nodded smugly. Corinne stared down at her plate, and her silence was the final betrayal. Even the people at the next table looked away, their fake ignorance somehow making the humiliation worse. And here is what I keep coming back to, the thing that makes this so much more than a simple insult. I looked into my son's eyes, and for one split second I saw the little boy I'd taught to ride a bike, a flicker of something that might have been regret. But it was buried too deep under designer clothes and entitlement, and the rage I expected to feel never came. Instead there was a cold, sharp clarity, a terrible certainty that it was over. I placed my napkin beside my untouched cake. I stood. My chair made no sound at all. I looked at Corinne, at Garrett, and finally at Damon. And then, without a single word, I turned and walked out, and the heavy door closed behind me, leaving them to their hollow little victory. I didn't need to say anything. My actions were about to do all the talking. I didn't hail a cab. I walked. The wealthy streets slowly gave way to my own quieter neighborhood, and my house came into view under the shadow of an old oak, a solid brick home I'd designed and helped build with my own hands 30 years earlier. It wasn't flashy. It was durable, like me. Inside, everything was in its place, the air smelling of old wood and the paper of the books lining my shelves. This was my sanctuary, a world away from the phoniness I'd just left. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour a drink, because anger clouds judgment, and tonight I needed to be colder than ice. I went into my study, a small room where everything had a purpose. On the walls hung blueprints of bridges and buildings. I'd helped create real things, things that last. And on the corner of the desk sat a silver-framed photograph of Damon at 5 years old, wearing an oversized plastic hard hat, grinning on my shoulders at a job site, his eyes full of pure pride and love. Where did I lose that boy? The question hit me not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, weary ache that had been building for years. I had been too quiet for too long. I had believed my unconditional love would be enough, and I had been wrong because unconditional love does not mean unconditional sacrifice. And tonight, the sacrificing was going to end. If you've ever realized that the kindest thing you ever did for someone was the very thing that ruined them, you understand the weight I was carrying in that chair. I sat down at my old, slow, but reliable desktop computer and opened an encryption program I'd installed years before. I typed a long password that no one else on Earth knew, and a simple interface appeared with a list of folders. The names meant nothing unless you knew what they really were. Holding companies, property firms, a seed funding agreement, a car lease, a consulting payment schedule. Each name was an invisible thread I had used to weave the entire world. My son now lived in the world he believed he'd built himself. It was like being the engineer of a bridge. You can't see the steel reinforcement hidden deep inside the concrete, but without it, the whole structure collapses. And tonight, I was going to begin a structural integrity test. I opened a secure email to a brilliant attorney named Adelaide Frost, a friend I trusted with my life, the woman who had quietly helped me build this entire financial fortress. The message was short. No pleasantries. Just a subject line: begin the sunset protocol, and a single instruction to start dissolving every asset tied to my son, beginning with the car. I hit send. A soft whoosh echoed in the silent room. It was done. The first domino was now balanced at the very edge of the table. I felt no satisfaction, no glee. Just a strange, quiet calm. The calm of an engineer who knows his design is about to face its final test. I had built Damon's life. Now it was time to see whether the boy could stand once the scaffolding came down. The next morning, in Adelaide's office on the 45th floor of a glass tower, she met me not with a handshake, but with a heavy mug of black coffee, made the second she'd read my email, because that was how I drank it when I meant business. She sat in the chair beside me instead of behind her desk, making us equals, and she admitted that when she'd seen those two words Sunset Protocol, her heart had sunk, because she'd always hoped it was a plan we'd never have to use. She'd hoped Damon would figure it out on his own. So had I. But the sun had set, and it was time to turn off the lights. She asked me to walk her through the human part, the part the legal documents couldn't hold. What was the final straw? And I told her. I told her my son had said the word out loud, in public, in front of strangers. He'd called me a loser and called Garrett a winner, and Corrine had simply sat there and let it happen. And the worst part, I said, was that Damon truly believed it. He honestly believed the world he lived in was one he had created. Now, here's where the story turns, and I need you to stay with me, because this is where you understand just how badly they'd all misjudged me. Years earlier, Adelaide reminded me. Damon had come to me with a half-baked proposal for a software company, full of buzzwords and fantasy projections, with no discipline and no money behind it. And I had known that if I simply handed my son $2 million, the boy would burn through it in a year and learn nothing. So I did something far more clever. I told Damon my money was all tied up in boring retirement funds. And Damon, disappointed, called me old-fashioned and walked away. But I didn't walk away. I went to Adelaide. Together we set up a silent trust, funded with $2 million, based in Delaware for anonymity. Then we created a shell venture capital firm on the West Coast and hired a retired professor to be its friendly public face. And as far as Damon ever knew, he'd been discovered by a group of forward-thinking investors who saw his genius. He flew out, pitched his idea, and walked out with a check. He never once wondered why it had been so easy. He never asked who actually owned the firm that funded him. And the ownership of his company reflected the truth. 60% of the shares belonged to that shell firm, which was wholly owned by my anonymous trust. Damon held 20% as CEO, which meant he didn't own his company at all. He was its highest-paid employee, and his invisible board of directors was, for all practical purposes, me. Then there was the car, the luxury sedan Damon insisted he needed to project success to clients. His personal credit had been too thin to lease it himself, so he'd had the company lease it, or so he thought. In reality, the lease was with one of my holding companies, dressed up as a third-party fleet management firm. Damon had signed the paperwork without reading a word, thrilled with his shiny new toy. And the contract was explicit. The moment he was no longer an employee, the car was no longer his. And finally, the biggest piece of all, the penthouse. This one, Adelaide said, had always felt different, and I admitted it was, because it was about Corrine as much as Damon. After she'd left me, she'd become obsessed with appearances, and she'd filled our son's head with the idea that where you live defines who you are. Damon and Sienna had hunted for months for the perfect apartment, something to make their friends jealous, and they'd found it in a beautiful, renovated pre-war building. Damon had asked me to help with the deposit, and I had told him no, told him it was reckless to live beyond his means. What I didn't mention was that I had bought the entire building 3 years earlier. It had been an undervalued asset in a neighborhood about to gentrify, a solid investment bought through another of my companies. And when Damon applied for the penthouse, the property managers who worked for me contacted him with a special offer. They told him they wanted a high-profile tenant, like a young tech CEO, to add prestige to the building, and they offered him an incentive lease with virtually zero rent. Damon signed it and bragged for weeks that the landlord had been so impressed with him. He never read the fine print. No one ever does. The fine print made the entire arrangement contingent on his continued employment, terminable with 72 hours' notice. So there it was, the whole house of cards laid out on the desk. His company, his car, his home. Every pillar of his identity was an illusion that I had designed, funded, and quietly owned. Damon wasn't a self-made man. He was a son who had never been told the truth. He has nothing, I said. Everything he thinks is his is actually mine. And here is where I want to pause, because this next part is what separates a story about revenge from a story about something deeper. Adelaide asked me what my first move would be, and whether I wanted to hit Damon with everything at once, the car, the accounts, the eviction, All of it by noon on Monday. A full blitz. And I shook my head slowly and said no. Because that's destruction. That's revenge. And this was never about revenge. I explained it the only way an engineer could. When you need to bring down a building, I said, you don't just set off dynamite at the base. That's messy. It sends shrapnel everywhere and hurts innocent people. A real builder does it differently. You perform a controlled demolition. You remove the fixtures first, the shiny things that catch the eye. Then the windows, his view of the world. Then the floors, one by one, until all that's left is the bare foundation. I didn't want to destroy my son. I wanted to dismantle the lie he was living in, and force him to stand on the cold, hard foundation of reality. Honestly, looking back, I'm not sure most people could have done it that slowly. The discipline to take something apart piece by piece, when every instinct screams to just burn it all down at once, I think that came from 40 years of building things that had to hold weight. You learn patience, or things collapse. So we made a plan. Monday, the car the symbol of status. Give him a day to feel the loss. Tuesday, freeze the corporate accounts and cut the power, and Garrett's consulting payments along with it. Let the winner feel the pinch too. And Wednesday, when Damon was confused and powerless, deliver the eviction notice. Take away his security one wall at a time, so he could feel the value of each thing as he lost it. This wasn't a plan born of anger. It was a curriculum, a harsh, painful curriculum. And over that weekend, while I pruned my roses in quiet contemplation, my son spent the days congratulating himself. I pieced this together later, from frantic voicemails and tearful confessions. Damon laughed with his friends about putting his old man in his place, calling me a total drama queen, certain I'd come crawling back within a week like I always did. He saw a lifetime of my patience not as a gift, but as weakness. He saw my silence not as a warning, but as surrender. And he and Sienna shopped for a gold watch to treat themselves after the embarrassment of dinner, because in Damon's mind, he was the victim. He even called Garrett seeking praise. And Garrett supplied it like oil, telling him he'd done the right thing, setting boundaries with a man from a different generation, a man who didn't understand the mindset of a winner. And Damon thanked him warmly, saying it was good to finally have a real role model. A real role model, a man whose entire business was a single inflated contract with a company I owned. The irony was a bitter pill, and my son swallowed it without tasting a thing. Then Monday came. I spent it peacefully, reading on my porch, but I knew that across town the gears were turning. Damon rode the private elevator down to the garage in his expensive suit, feeling like the king of the world, and walked toward his gleaming car. And there was a grimy tow truck parked behind it, yellow lights pulsing, a man in blue overalls kneeling by the rear tire. Damon's good mood evaporated. He barked at the man to move his rust bucket, and the driver stood up slowly, completely unimpressed, and said he wasn't blocking the car, he was there to repossess it. The words didn't register. Damon actually laughed. He said it had to be a mistake. The car was a corporate lease. The man had the wrong vehicle. But the driver held up a work order with Damon's license plate on it, issued not by his company, but by a holding company Damon had never heard of. He called the leasing company, voice shaking, and a perfectly polite woman confirmed it. The lease had been terminated that morning by the legal owner of the vehicle, and there was nothing to be done. The matter was closed. He stood there in his $1,000 suit and watched the front wheels of his car lift off the ground. He watched the symbol of his entire identity get dragged up the ramp, rear wheels scraping meekly against the concrete, and hauled out into the daylight. Gone. The yellow lights flashed once more around the corner, and then there was only silence and the smell of diesel and an empty parking space. The first pillar had just been ripped away. He had no idea it was only the beginning. If the car was a tremor, Tuesday was the earthquake. Damon arrived at his office an hour late, furious, having taken an expensive rideshare across town, determined to project calm. He stopped at the lobby coffee shop, where he was a well-known regular, ordering his usual lavish round for his executive team, handing over the sleek black corporate card with no spending limit. And the card was declined. The barista ran it again. Declined. People in line behind him began to stare, and his face went a deep, blotchy red as the tech wonder kid couldn't buy a round of coffee. He fled upstairs to his glass-walled corner office and opened the company's financial portal, his control panel, and typed in his credentials. Access denied. He tried again, slowly, perfectly. Access denied. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. He, the CEO, the founder, was locked out of his own company's money. And then an email appeared, informing him that the majority shareholders had suspended all executive access to accounts, credit, and spending, effective immediately, pending a full audit. The majority shareholders. The phrase echoed in his head. He had always thought of them as silent partners, content to let him run the show. He had been so wrong. They weren't silent at all, and they had just stripped him of everything without a single phone call. And then his phone rang, and it was Garrett. But it wasn't the smooth, confident voice of the winner he admired. It was high, strained, panicked. Garrett's monthly consulting fee hadn't deposited, and it was never late, and he had payments due: the mortgage on the lake house, the payment on Corinne's new car. The man Damon had called a role model just days before was screaming at him like a terrified child, demanding he fix it, because his only business, his entire livelihood, was that single contract. And Damon felt the floor drop out from under him, because he was beginning to sense, somewhere deep down, that all of it was connected. This is the part of the story where you start to understand something my son still couldn't see. Garrett wasn't a winner. He never had been. He was a man performing a life he couldn't afford, and the only thing holding it up was money flowing secretly from the very man he loved to belittle me. Strip that away, and there was nothing underneath but fear. And isn't that true of so many people who look down on the quiet ones? The loudest person in the room is so often the most fragile. By Wednesday, Damon came home a hollow man, having spent the day a prisoner in his glass office, dodging vendors, enduring the pitying stares of his own employees. The penthouse was the only thing he had left. But inside, Sienna was waiting in a storm of panic. Her personal card, the one he paid for, had been declined at the salon in front of everyone, and before he could even answer her, there was a sharp, authoritative knock at the door. A man in a crisp gray suit stood there, holding a manila envelope. He introduced himself as the new property manager and stepped inside as if he owned the place, because in a way, I did. He looked around at the designer furniture and the sweeping views, utterly unimpressed, and then handed Damon a formal notice of lease termination. Damon protested that the lease was paid for the year, that they had a special arrangement. And the manager smiled thinly and pointed to the exact clause: the incentive lease was contingent on his employment, and since he was no longer employed in a qualifying capacity, the lease was void. 72 hours. By Friday at 5. That was how long they had to leave. And that was when Sienna broke completely, a choked sob escaping her, then a wail, demanding to know where they were supposed to go, turning on Damon and screaming that he had done this with his arrogance, his stupid fight with his father, that he had ruined everything she'd built her life around. The manager watched the whole thing with the detached interest of a scientist observing insects, then calmly told them anything left behind after the deadline would be disposed of, and walked out. And in the silence after her sobs, Damon looked down at the eviction notice and saw at the small print at the bottom the name of yet another company he didn't recognize. A car taken by one company, a business seized by anonymous shareholders, a home taken by another. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was coordinated. It was personal. And a lifetime of resentment finally collapsed into a single point of understanding. There was only one person quiet enough, clever enough, and ruthless enough to do this. The man he had called a failure. His hands shook as he dialed the number he hadn't called in over a week. I answered on the second ring, my voice steady and calm, and that calm broke the last of his restraint. He snarled into the phone that I had done this. All of it, the car, the company, the apartment. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. And on my end there was a long silence, the same silence from the restaurant, the same silence from the weekend. But this time it wasn't weakness. It was the silence of absolute power. And when I finally spoke, my voice quiet but heavy as an anvil, I simply said it was time we had a talk. Now slow down with me here, because this is the longest, most important moment in the whole story, and it deserves to be stretched out, every second of it. Damon arrived less than 30 minutes later in a rattling rideshare, a far cry from the silent luxury of the car he'd lost. I didn't go to the door. I waited in my study, the same room where I'd launched the entire protocol, and let the doorbell ring twice before I spoke into the intercom and told my son to come in. And Damon stormed in, not with the confidence of a CEO, but with the blustering rage of a cornered child, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, his face pale and slick with desperate sweat. He stood in the doorway and looked around that small study, and for the first time in his life he wasn't seeing my dusty, boring hobby room. He was seeing it for what it truly was. The command center. I sat behind the old oak desk and didn't stand, didn't raise my voice. I just folded my hands and let the silence stretch, forcing him to break first. And Damon burst out, "How could you do this? To your own son, to your family? You've destroyed everything I worked for." And that phrase, "worked for," was so absurd, so detached from reality, that I almost laughed. But this wasn't a time for laughter. It was a time for a cold, hard lesson. I gestured to the simple wooden chair across from me and told my son to sit down, that the yelling was over, that now it was time to listen. And there was an authority in my voice he had never heard before. So he sat, the anger still on his face, but mixing now with a confused, fearful apprehension, the look of a man who feels the ground shifting beneath him without understanding why. And then I turned the monitor to face him, and one by one, I showed him everything. I opened the file on the company and explained the shell firm, the anonymous trust, the controlling 60%. I showed my son the incorporation papers with my own name as the sole owner. I said quietly, "You don't own your company, Damon. You're its highest paid employee. The board of directors you've never met, that's me." And Damon shook his head, whispering, "No, no, that's not possible. I built it." And I didn't argue. I just moved to the next document. I showed him the car lease, held by a holding company he'd never heard of. "You didn't earn that car," I said. "You were permitted to drive it. And when your behavior no longer merited it, the permission was revoked." Then I opened the deed to the entire apartment building, my own name on it, and explained there was no special incentive lease, that it was a fiction created to make him feel special. "You weren't a high-profile tenant," I said gently, the softness making it land harder. "You were my son, living rent-free in my house, and your behavior was no longer welcome." The blood drained from his face as he stared at the irrefutable black-and-white proof of his entire fraudulent life. Every pillar he had used to define himself, an illusion I had built, and the anger finally went out of him, replaced by something far worse, pure humiliation. But I wasn't finished. There was one more piece, the keystone. I said very quietly, "You called me a loser, and you called Garrett a winner. You called him your role model. Let's talk about your role model." And I opened the final folder and showed my son a single contract, a $50,000 monthly payment from his own company to Garrett's consulting business. And I asked, "Did you ever wonder why Garrett never talked about his other clients? Why his only business seemed to be giving you advice? That $50,000 a month is his only income, Damon. Your company is his only client, and your company is funded entirely by my money." And I let the sentence hang there, and let my son connect the final, devastating dots himself. Damon's eyes went wide. He actually recoiled in his chair. The winner he admired so much, the man his mother had left me for, the man who lectured him on ambition from a big house with a fancy car, his entire lifestyle was funded by me. I paid his mortgage. I paid for Corinne's new car. The money flowed from my trust, through Damon's company, straight into Garrett's pocket. The winner his mother chose was on the payroll of the loser she'd left behind. That was the final blow. Damon made a small, choking sound, and the entire structure of his life, his success, his heroes, his identity came crashing down in the silence of that small, dusty room. He finally understood. He wasn't a player in the game. He wasn't even a piece on the board. He was the ball, passed from hand to hand, and he'd never even known it. And here is the lesson buried in that moment. The thing I understood that nobody else in this story ever did. Money given without wisdom isn't a gift. It's a cage. For years I had confused financial support with love, and in doing so, I'd let my patience be mistaken for weakness and built a man who could perform success without ever understanding it. The hardest thing I ever learned was that true love sometimes looks like taking everything away, so a person is finally forced to stand on solid ground and build something real with their own hands. I leaned back and closed the laptop, the soft click echoing like a door shutting. I told my son I hadn't taken anything from him. I'd simply taken back what was mine. And then, for the first time in his adult life, I told him he had a real opportunity. To go get a job, a real job, any job. It didn't matter if it was waiting tables or construction. To pay rent on an apartment he could actually afford. To learn the value of a dollar earned with sweat. To learn humility and respect. And most of all, to learn who he was when he had nothing. The trust still existed, I said, and his name was still in it. But he wouldn't see another dime until he'd proven he could build something himself. And then I stood up, my old bones aching, and walked out of the study, leaving my son alone with the truth. I didn't look back. There was nothing more to say. The days that followed were the quietest I had known in 30 years. No frantic calls, no manipulative texts, no manufactured family dramas demanding my silent intervention. Just peace. I sat on my back porch one warm evening with a glass of iced tea, the chair rocking in a slow rhythm, and I realized something. I had never been the loser. I had been the host for a parasite, and now, finally, I was free. I had completed my final project, not a bridge of steel, but the careful demolition of a toxic structure, leaving room for something new to grow. And then my phone rang. It was Corrine. I almost didn't answer, but some lingering curiosity made me pick up and say nothing. Just listen. And her voice poured through in raw, unfiltered panic. Garrett was ruined. The consulting contract was gone. The bank was foreclosing on the lake house. They were taking her car. Her country club membership had been suspended. And it was all my fault, she shrieked, because I was jealous, because I'd decided to destroy all of them. How could I be so cruel after everything we'd shared? There was no apology for the dinner, no concern for our son, just a desperate, selfish demand that I put her world back together because I had the money. I always had the money, and I owed her. And in that moment, I felt the last chain of obligation turn to dust and blow away. She hadn't changed. She never would. I let her run out of steam, let the silence stretch long and uncomfortable, listened to the crickets, and watched a firefly blink in the dark. And when I finally spoke, my voice held no anger and no satisfaction at all, just a simple statement of a new and permanent truth. Corrine, I said, that is no longer my problem. And I ended the call and placed the phone face down, and leaned back, and let the slow rhythm of the chair return. I had reclaimed my dignity. I had reclaimed my peace. I had reclaimed my life. And in the perfect silence of that evening, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the man my son had called a loser finally felt like a winner. So let me ask you something before we go, because I genuinely want to know where you land on this. Do you think I did the right thing? Comment 1 if you believe I was completely justified, that this was tough love and my son needed every bit of it. Comment 2 if you think I went too far, that stripping away everything at once was its own kind of cruelty. Or comment 3 if you think the real culprits here were Corrine and Garrett, and my son was just the product they created. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now, because I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were actually capable of? Tell me about it. I read every single comment. If this story moved you, do me a small favor and subscribe, because we tell stories like this one here all the time, stories about quiet people who get underestimated, and the moment the truth finally comes to light. I'd love to have you here for the next one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end, and thank you for caring. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Oregon, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. 70. You said hay viết lại ước mơ đầu mạnh hơn giật gần hơn.